So these nine daughters eventually, so actually the story is in Creole whether there were nine or ten. Sometimes the story is they were ten, sometimes they were nine. And they had kids. It's not clear how. Like, were there other people living around? Do- How did they have kids? Um, but so this is the story of the creation of that particular group of people. Um, there's another neighboring group that say that their story of creation is God created their ancestor, and he was located on the moon. So after he was done creating their ancestor, he stretched out a skin of, I guess it was a cow, because he also gave them a bunch of cows. And so that's how they came from the moon to the earth, and therefore they believe that all cows belong to them. Um, Very interesting stories. But the point is that every group of people has their own stories of creation, or stories of origin, or stories of their pasts, the stories of heroic actions, stories of defeat and of triumph. And so we started looking at the stories of Latin America and what some of the communities explain what's happening to them at the coming of Europeans. And so we sort of pick up from here. And technology is not planning to work today. So, um, stories of origin, stories of triumphs, stories of uh, creation. But in the case of Latin America, more like stories of colonialism and fighting against colonialism. Because we are only focusing on Latin America since independence, we're going to skip the other parts as we started doing. Let's use work. So we're going to skip the stories of origins and creation, but it's important to understand that even some of these stories of triumph and fighting of invaders have something to do with how people recall their history, the function of memory. So, for example, we are mentioning that some of the earliest attempts at ending colonialism harken back to previous figures. We have talked about Tupac Katari, uh, who took on the name of Tupac Amaru, who was one of the earliest individuals to protest Spanish rule. Of course, he was murdered, but we have also seen that the actions of Tupac Atari and then, well, Tupac Amaru and then Tupac Katari inspired tales of liberation. They would inspire individuals like Simon Bolivar, Jose San Martin, and these would form some of the earliest memories. Now, we also bring the five um, viceroyalties that made up the Spanish and Portuguese colonial control of Latin America. So, viceroyalties of New Spain. We mentioned that New Spain was the US, Mexico, and modern day Central America. And then New Granada, which became Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia, and eventually Panama. So you can actually sort of see where Panama protrudes out there. The Viceroyalty of Peru, which became Peru, and the Viceroyalty of La Plata, which became Argentina, and the southern parts of Argentina that were not settled, that were actually called the Pampas. Now, Brazil was mostly settled along the eastern coasts, and even today, if you think about the conditions in Brazil, the interior is still the Amazon, the jungle, and there's a big controversy, particularly the previous president, Jair Bolsonaro, who called himself the Brazilian Trump, the Latin American Trump, because he was very into, well, he really didn't care about the rainforests, and he's like, let's just cut off all the trees and use that land for farming and other things. And of course, the Amazon is one of the great catchment areas for water. And so, even though we are, so when we think about what we're focusing on, we are thinking about Latin America, that region that is bounded by Romantic languages, Portuguese, French, and Spanish. And so these are the areas that we are. Now, the little magenta, maybe, colors, region up there is Guyana, which was a British colony, and next to it is Suriname, which was controlled by the Dutch. We talked about these confusing terms and how they are used interchangeably. Peninsulares, Pardos, Mestizos, Mulattoes, Zambos, and Criollos, which all refer to people of different. It sounds wrong to say people of different, of mixed ethnicities. But we also mentioned Criollos, and how we are going to see a lot of military rulers are going to be Criollos, including probably today. I just mentioned Pampa, so we'll see some of that. Some important dates, and these are actually condensed dates. So we briefly mentioned the Tupac Amaru rebellion, mentioned that Haiti was the first Caribbean nation, but in terms of history, a lot of references will be made to the Western Hemisphere. So the first Western Hemisphere country to declare independence, which was also majority enslaved. So majority of the population was slaves. And if you actually think about the process of independence, Haiti becomes the first country to actually, maybe after the US, to declare independence. Then we are going to see a very rapid decolonization of Latin America. There's going to be a lot of murders, just so we are clear on that. For example, in Mexico, Father Miguel Hidalgo was executed in 1811 because of agitating for independence against the Spaniards. We'll see the independence of regions such as the Gran Colombia, the formation of Venezuela, but also, quite a rapid decolonization. Actually, within about 15 years, majority of Latin America will become independent. Compare that with later independence in other parts of the world, and that took a while. So, for example, in Africa, it took almost 50 years between Egypt's independence in 1952 and Namibia's in like 1992. But we also see other unusual developments. For example, Brazil declares independence from Portugal in a sort of weird way because King Pedro's son, Pedro II, is the one who declares independence kind of from his father, who then returns to Portugal from where they had been kicked out by Napoleon when he took over the Iberian Peninsula. And so it's kind of most unusual that he declares independence and establishes the Empire of Brazil, which will last until 1888 when he is forced to free the enslaved peoples. And so, even as we are talking about independence, independence has different shades. So, for example, in Brazil, independence wasn't, or rather, slavery continued until about 1887. In Cuba, it continued until about 1892, at least on paper it was, even though it wasn't quite being practiced. Um, but we're also going to see, so when we talk about liberation, we are going to see a number of threads. Some African peoples would support independence, but that didn't mean that independence would actually come to them and result in freedom. So this is a very unique feature of especially Latin America. Um, Even though you can probably say the same about the US. The US declares independence from Britain, but it is its enslaved populations continue to be held for another almost 100 years, held in slavery. So you will begin to see some common threads. We will see, for example, the independence of Bolivia, which brought, so before Bolivia becomes independent, we see the like-minded thinking by Simon Bolivar and Jose San Martin, who are seen as two of the most important Latin American liberation figures in their attempt to unify their territories, which didn't come to anything. In fact, contrary to unity, they break apart. Grand Colombia breaks apart in 1829 and it becomes these four countries. And so when we think about what independence means, we think about memory and heroes and so, for example, in Mexico, Father Miguel Hidalgo, who was a priest and then a professor and then freedom fighter, is valued very much. Brazilians, as we mentioned, revere Dom Pedro, the son of Dom Pedro, the king, as the person who established the Brazilian Empire, which is kind of weird if you sort of think about it, because 20% of the population was still enslaved. Some Bolivians will think of Tupac Katari, as we mentioned. Venezuelans, Colombians, and Peruvians will revere Simon Bolivar. And so again, when you think about who independence is attributed to, it's quite different. We mentioned Manuel Sainz, but again, when we are talking about who leads Latin America to independence, there's really not one person. Um, in fact, when you think about like the Mexican-American War, it was ended by a treaty named after Miguel Hidalgo. So this kind of gives you the importance of, but again, if you then think about what Nicolas Maduro and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, were doing in Venezuela, they erect this mausoleum for Simon Bolivar. And so when we sort of think about the process of Latin American independence, we see the period between 1790 and 1830 as the most significant. And so we actually see the independence of most Latin American countries. In fact, most countries in the Western Hemisphere, other than Canada and Cuba. Cuba would not become independent from the Spanish until after the Mexican-American War of 1898. But even then, Cuba would not become independent because it was taken over by the United States, and the United States literally almost absorbed Cuba. We see connections. We briefly mentioned Simon Bolivar's letter from Jamaica. He had actually been exiled to Jamaica and he was writing about the fate of Latin Americans as a people. Um, We shall also see how European wars affect Latin America, in particular the Napoleonic Wars. We have previously mentioned that they caused the Portuguese kingdom to move to Brazil, where then it's going to split and Brazil is going to declare independence, even though that's a little weird. And so when you sort of think about the broader narrative of what is Latin America's independence, what does it mean? What does it mean for the formation of new countries? But also, when you think about the local stories, like what is Tupac? Is it Tupac Amaru and Tupac Katari that really begin Latin America's independence? Or is it Miguel Hidalgo? Or is it Bolivar and or is it a case of it depends on who is telling the story? You look and the difference here, maybe we should mention, is for example, Tupac Amaru and Tupac Katari are indigenous or Native Americans. Now, when you think about the racial composition of this region, Native, I don't know if we should call them Native Americans or Indian Americans or American Indians. Um, is their story told more than that of the, for example, Don Pedro, who was, I think, a foreigner and who declares the so-called independence? And so when we sort of think about, and this is the thing about all stories, when we tell stories, what do we privilege? Whose story is being told, and what is the narrative that we intend to sort of privilege? So when we sort of think about independence, constitutionalism, and elites in Latin America, we go back to thinking about where ideas of independence came from. Now, for majority of this region, independence was against, if you think about it in two sort of ways, there's the native rebellions against Spanish rule. So, for example, this is what Tupac Amaru and Tupac Katari are doing. And, Native American or Indian Americans, the Aztecs, the Incas, and so on. But then now this independence movement is a mix of either Creoles or any of the other biracial and multiracial groups that are chafing under the control of the Spaniards. So this kind of two narratives of independence, um, and so the first ones are not really that much celebrated. But so when we, and again, I think this is an error on the part of history and or historians or what we maybe we privilege. But we can see opposition to colonial regimes, for example, Guajira in Colombia or Quechua and Aymara in Peru. So there were these elements of um, so the question then is what precipitates Latin American independence or the agitation for independence? Is it the protests by Indian Americans, or is it in part driven by the social and economic conditions of enslaved peoples who are looking for freedom? Or is it Amerindians, American Indians, who are actually chafing at their lands being taken over? And you actually find that it's a mix of everything. There were some slaves who rebelled and they would join different sides if they were promised independence. You would find that mulattoes would often, depending on whether they had freedoms, would um, begin the slave or the revolts. But you actually find that particularly Creoles, uh, who were especially either part Spanish but born in the colonies, or full-blooded Spaniards who were often dispossessed, would be at the forefront of leadership in these countries. And you actually find these trends even today. There are very few Amerindian or native or American Indian leaders of these countries. It's more like the um, more mixed blood peoples who have come to rule these places. But we also have to think about other sources of liberation. So, for example, if you think about American independence, we can clearly see this was a function of Enlightenment thinking. Now, Enlightenment thinking wasn't a big thing in Latin America. In fact, there was very little by way of Enlightenment thinking. Those ideas of equality of all men, that people should form governments, you do not really find a lot of this. Now, again, when you sort of think about the difference between these viceroyalties, they were more loyalist than they were oppositional. So, again, here it helps to maybe think about the United States and think about the 13 colonies. So, if you actually look at the 13 colonies, about half of the people who lived here were loyalists. In other words, they supported the king. But the other 60% were like, either they don't know or they wanted freedom. But you find in Latin America, in a lot of these viceroyalties, they were more like, yeah, we are part of France. We're just an outside department of France. And so ideas of independence were not that wide. So there was a lot of loyalty to the Bourbon dynasty, which supported slavery. In fact, um, for example, Haiti becomes, or the first revolt in Haiti starts in 1791, started by a mulatto who was actually in France during the French Revolution, goes to Haiti, tries to stop a rebellion, and then he is quickly killed. So there wasn't really much space for rebellion, and so there was a lot of fidelity to the colonial, but also there was a significant element of religious adherence. So a lot of these places, even today, are still Catholic. We have probably mentioned Christ the Redeemer statue in Brazil, which is a Catholic relic, but we actually see a lot of fidelity to the Catholic religion. So there wasn't, unlike the US, where you might see that a lot of people who moved here were Protestants, unlike in Britain, there's synergy between the colonies of the Spaniards and the Portuguese and Spain and Portugal. And so there wasn't, absent the Enlightenment and these schisms, there was probably more harmony in Latin America than there was anywhere else. Um, Now, of course, there was a great bigger divide in the kinds of people. So African Americans, mulattoes, mestizos, and all these other groups that we have made. Uruguay split or was hived out off from Brazil, and Dominican Republic, and yeah, Brazil declared independence from Spain. And so when we this probably goes back to the stories of who was instrumental in the freedom of, or who started the Latin American independence movement. And so, according to Dawson, the author of this book, it was it occurred in the Andes Mountains. So if you sort of think about Peru, There's a huge mountain range that goes all the way down Chile, and so that is the Andes. It's a very high mountain, and in fact, this would become a huge factor in the fight for independence because when um, Peru begins to agitate for independence, the Spaniards send troops. But their troops are not used to fighting in very high altitude places, and so they have this mountain sickness. While the Peruvians actually recruit American Indians to fight for them, so it almost was inevitable that the Spaniards would lose the war to take back these revolting. But so Tupac Amaru arrests the governor, holds him, so the Spanish governor, and then executes him. And after he executes him, this is where the Spaniards send troops and arrest him and kill him. So, yeah, it's often seen as the first shot at. Now, there's a difference between um, the rebellions of Native Americans and maybe the more independence-minded individuals. So even though this is still sort of the tail end of the rebellions by the Native Americans, it's going to also bring in new rebellions by Creoles, which will lead to independence. Now, we also want to mention that so if you think about slavery in North America and think about some of the ways in which individuals fought back against slavery, so whether they were maroons or just work stoppages, you also see this in Latin America. So maroon communities like in Palmares in Brazil. The one in Brazil actually was it was almost like a whole country, and they had these rules. If you made it to Palmares, you were free. Um, yeah, and part of what these movements were based on, it's sort of like we were moved from our original homelands, and so now we are going to build a world without these Europeans who took us. But you actually see some similarities. In fact, if you, I don't know if any of you have watched the movie Lincoln. It's worth watching for many reasons. But one of the things that actually comes out in this is not artistic license is that the territories between Virginia, so here, to Brazil, had the same sort of confederate structure. They had the same political and racial and economic systems sort of saw themselves as similar. And so, the enslaved people lacked statehood. They lacked personhood, actually, because, they were property. Um, they were generally not recognized. They were kept in the same kinds of circumstances. And if you think about which part of the world received the most enslaved Africans, that would be Brazil. But also the Caribbean received almost another half, um, um, half of the enslaved Africans, about 5 million, well, about 4 million and some change. And so you find the growth of these maroon communities, and increasingly they were trying to create maybe replacement communities, countries. Um, and so even within the there wasn't so much maybe control uh, as there might have been in North America. As we mentioned, like Brazil, the interior was really more like mountains and Native Americans. But the irony was that the Maroons actually didn't happen in necessary inland. Suriname is really just up there. But also in places like Jamaica, there was a very successful Maroon community in Jamaica. So, again, it's almost like people sought freedom. People desired freedom. We have, or ought to at least briefly talk about Haiti, the outbreak of the revolution in 1791, again, as previously mentioned. Vincent Oge, who was a mulatto, he was a free man, and he was visiting France during the French Revolution. And so this was 1791. The French Revolution begins in 1789. This is a constitutional monarchy phase where the king was still alive and sharing power with the parliament. And so Vincent Ogi thought that this was a good idea. He goes to Haiti, starts a rebellion, and that didn't go very far. Um, it kind of, I'm going to take that back and say it only went as far as the extent that in 1793, so 1792, the constitutional monarchy phase ends in France, and they bring in what they call the radical republicanism period. So the radical republicanism, the difference between constitutional monarchy and radical republicanism was that they killed the king, they killed Marie Antoinette, and now it was just, this is the parliament, we're in charge, we are. So they formulate very interesting laws, and I apologize, I don't have one of those slides here, but so one of the things that, so Article 6 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, that's what the French call their law, Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So Article 6 actually looks more like the First Amendment to the US Constitution. So they guarantee freedom of speech, press, religion, and then the second part of that article guarantees the ability to petition government or to participate in government. Another part of that article speaks about the right to a fair trial. So you can actually see a lot of both Enlightenment thought, but also the U.S. Declaration and the amendments to the Constitution. And so one of the things that comes out of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is that France abolishes slavery. So when it abolishes slavery in 1793 in France and all its territories, that includes Haiti. So slavery is abolished, and the person who was kind of really associated with the Haitian rebellion after Vincent Oge was killed is Toussaint Louverture. But his view is that if we let everyone go, who's going to work the farms and who's going to do the production? Haiti, or say Saint Domingue at the time, was said to produce at least 50% of the world's sugar. I mean, 50% of the coffee and almost half of the world's sugar. So it's lucrative. And if you're going to build a country, you probably need a source of income. And so he's like, well, maybe we should re-enslave some people, or at least force them to do some labor. So Haiti goes through these few years of challenges, even though people have been freed, and of course people want to farm on their. They didn't get 40 acres exactly, but they found plots where they could do the farming, and so that was probably his greatest fear, that we are breaking up the economy. But again, if you look at the population, there was 500,000 enslaved Africans and about 30,000 Frenchmen and about the same number of mulattoes. Now, some of them were not free, some of them were free. And actually, the mulattoes then joined the slaves because they want freedom. And the Frenchmen are like, yeah, so what do we do? Actually, almost 5,000 of them were killed. But the rebellion is going to begin to peter out when Napoleon takes back power in France, and he fights some people out there, he fights other people, he's beginning to win, and then he's like, well, maybe we should reconstitute the French Empire. And oh, by the way, there was Saint Domingue over there, and we should go get it together with Louisiana. But the French were not very good at maybe fighting at that point. Um, Actually, they were really not good at sending their troops long distances over water. And so this is really where the weakness comes in. So majority of the troops that come to Saint Domingue will die of malaria and other tropical diseases, and so they are unable to recover Haiti. So Haiti declares independence in 1804. Dessalines is the person who becomes the leader. He declares himself emperor, and then 2 years later he is murdered, which is kind of what goes on in Haiti even today. Very sad. But so 1804, Haiti is independent, and as you will see, Simon Bolivar is in Haiti in 1812. So he writes, he actually goes, he's exiled from, but he is also going around the Caribbean looking at what independence looks like. 1811, the war for Mexican independence is beginning. He is traveling to Haiti, he's traveling to Jamaica, and his idea is that we can learn from these revolutions, and then maybe go back and fight the raise money, raise troops, promise freedom to people who would join the liberation movements. And so he will go back to Grand Colombia and help fight for independence, and it's become independent. So I think we covered this French National Assembly, French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte, troops, malaria, and so yeah, the French are defeated. But again, as I mentioned, there are other uprisings in other places. Um, so there's quite a number of individuals that are associated with these uprisings. So, for example, Jose, no, Juan Izaguirre, who was actually not Iturrigues, who was in Venezuela, and so he is talking about the desire for independence. But again, remember, he is a Creole, and so Creoles could be free or enslaved. There's a very interesting concept that was called the womb laws. And so in some of these territories, womb laws determined if you were born free or not. So there were places where even if you were born from of a parent who was a slave, you are still free. But so if you sort of think about, okay, how are you a slave when you're raising a free child? But also if you can be sold, what then happens to your child? Are they sold with you? It was very confusing. But so, for example, in places like Buenos Aires in Argentina, people who are generally born even of slaves were, now Argentina didn't have a very big slave issue except maybe the north. The south, the Pampas, that's where they did a lot of the keeping cattle. But so you actually find in places like Brazil, the enact these free womb laws, especially for example in Brazil, and then in the southern parts like Peru and Chile. So yeah, even if you're born to an enslaved person, you could be free. But of course, that was very now in terms of recruiting people to fight. Freedom was very important, and so you find a lot of times that enslaved Africans would join freedom movements because they promised them freedom. But so again, you see even enslaved people. So yeah, um, Izaguirre uses the language of freedom to claim his own, yeah, but also enslaved peoples from like Brazil will support the freedom, or at least those people who purported. In fact, if you think of someone like um, Simon Bolivar, he recruits quite a number of Africans to help him fight for independence. So clearly, it was very important that freedom was part of the now. So Miranda, Bolivar, remember, um, especially Bolivar. Now, some of these individuals opposed slavery as a matter of principle. Again, as we mentioned, there wasn't widespread um, there wasn't really widespread enlightenment thought. So it's not even like the US in the North where most people kind of opposed slavery, for example, the Quakers. But you see this language of freedom. Now, it was probably also practical because if you can get more people to join your cause, if you look at Haiti, really, for example, 500,000 enslaved people against 30,000. Even the sheer numbers just say, even if you have pitchforks, you're just going to maybe, and the guns then didn't work the way they do. But so some of them opposed slavery. And again, if you think of people like Jose San Martin and Simon Bolivar, these were Creoles. They were not Spaniards, but they were also not black. So it's sort of like, why do they support freedom for now? Again, these were very structured societies in terms of your station in life, and sometimes we still find that today. But so we actually see what is called the liberals, like Jose San Martin, Simon Bolivar, and quite a number of other, for example, Miguel Hidalgo, for independence. And some of them actually believed in freedom, greater freedom, individual freedom, equality before the law, um, elimination of trade restrictions, and other things. But they also wanted to end the power, especially of the church, of the nobility, and of the military. And so you can sort of see quite a number of, again, if you think about the structures that were used to keep slavery in place, Creoles, second class citizens, enslaved Africans. So these were economic systems. The church was complicit. Um, but they also, interestingly, wanted to end the communal Indian village because they thought that this was a restriction of private property. We ought to probably mention that there was a very interesting relationship between American Indians or Native Americans, even in South America, with the um, with the Spanish and Portuguese governments. So, in theory, they were equal. There were these treaties. But if you think about what happened in the U.S., sort of like, yeah, we are going to sign treaties, but then we are just going to do what we want to do. And so you actually found that for the most part, American Indians would often side with the colonialists in an attempt to maintain these relationships, to be able to argue for the treaties to be respected. And so for the enslaved peoples and the Creoles, it's sort of like, why are you supporting the people who are taking your stuff? But we're supporting the people who are taking our stuff so they don't take all our stuff. Sort of think of like Oklahoma. So Oklahoma is 46% Native American territory. It's probably the biggest amount of land Native Americans have. Now, so the US government is no respecter of treaties, but what Native Americans believed was that they could get more by collaborating with these governments than by fighting them. And so a lot of times you'd see them collaborate with the colonialists, And so, again, if you are fighting the Spaniards, you are looking at who are the friends of the Spaniards. Native American villages would be, but they were really, I think, in survival mode. And so this can sometimes be a little, I don't know, maybe unfair to the Native Americans. I think they were suffering the same way. But so these were sort of the things that the pro-independence movements and the liberation movements were trying to. So greater freedoms, individual freedom, equality before the law, which is, I think, understandable, elimination of government trade restrictions, the church, the nobility. Interestingly, a lot of, at least some of the protests come from the church. Father Miguel Hidalgo was a priest, Catholic priest, and he's the one who is starting this uprising against the Spaniard government. But if you actually think about his role as a priest and why he starts the protest, it makes sense because the government would actually hoard food or require villages to bring in like a lot of harvest, and then they would starve, which is sort of like, how are we producing the food and we are starving? How is that fair? And so, yeah, this is with his whole name. Not even going to try and say his whole name. I just like the way he has such a long name. Like you take a minute to say, yeah. Yeah. So he kind of actually was influenced by the Enlightenment ideas. He was a priest. He assisted. Actually, part of what he was doing, and this was something that the colonial Spaniards did not want him to do. He was assisting poor farmers to plant better versions or better varieties of olives and grapes, which apparently was illegal. It's sort of like, why would that be illegal? Because apparently it would compete with Spain, and so that wasn't a good thing. Prevent competition, and so he makes what is known as the cry of Dolores, um, a speech urging people to protect the interest of the king because the governor he had sent was kind of like, you know, not very straight up person, but he also urges for the overthrow of the European born Spaniards because, you know, they kind of didn't understand what was going on, and maybe they were just being um, so they had this sort of extraterritoriality. In other words, only the king could punish for Father Miguel Hidalgo and the Virgin of Guadalupe, who is now celebrated in, yeah. So this is, yeah, Colombia. This is not the Virgin. Actually, you see how Colombia was used to liberate that's Cuba. Being liberated from the Spaniards. Now, of course, you see, is that Uncle Sam? Maybe no, the version of Uncle Sam. But this is a version of Colombia, yeah, reaching out to oppressed Cuba. So images can be powerful. Yeah, that's her, and she is. If you have visited the World War II Memorial in DC, the war in the Pacific, she is, yeah, she is. So this kinds of images, but so the Cry of Dolores, which features the Virgin of Guadalupe by Miguel Hidalgo, is really, even today the Mexican president celebrates the Cry of Hidalgo, and so if you sort of attach all those images together, now apparently this is what Father Miguel Hidalgo may have said. It is not necessarily known if that is what he said. A new dispensation comes to us today. Will you receive it? Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the land stolen 300 years ago from your fathers by the hated Spaniards? So, and again, this the other version of will you be slaves of Napoleon, or will you, as patriots, defend your religion? your hearts and your rights, and so yeah, yeah. Now, so then he raises an army, he marches, he talks about death to the Spaniards, and now, interestingly, he was suggesting for the restoration of the old Spaniard kingdom. It's useful to mention that when Napoleon takes over the Iberian Peninsula, he installs his brother as the king of, was it Portugal or Spain? Um, but so it's almost like we want to return to the colonial. So he wasn't really agitating for independence. It's more like let's return to the old king. Um, so, yeah, but anyway, so we shall, I think, pick up from here and look next time and look at how the pursuit for independence produces new realities in Latin America. Look at what they look like.